So happy to introduce our next speaker in the black track, Matt Trevors, who will be presenting on threat modeling for security professionals. So a little bit about Matt. Matt Trevors is a technical manager for Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. Matt has more than 15 years of experience in information technology, information security, and secure software development strategies. Matt obtained his master's in computer information systems from Boston University and his bachelor's in computer science from the University of New Brunswick. Matt also holds the CISM, CISSP, and CSP professional credentials. With that, I'd like to welcome Matt Trevors.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, so he stole one of my slides, which is good because I have too many for 30 minutes. The obligatory SCI disclaimer, so we'll go through that. So what we're going to talk about today, a little bit about me. I'll go over some terms, so when I say things, you'll know what I mean. May be different than what you interpret. We'll go over when we should do this exercise, what the exercise is, and why we're doing it. I'll review the OWASP top 10 pretty quickly, then the meat, the stride threat modeling, then I'll throw in some Octave Allegro, some mitigation strategies you can use, alternate sources of threats, and then obviously a summary. So Matt Trevors, this is always the most complicated slide in my deck because our company has an identity crisis. So depending on where you are, some people know CERT Division, some people know the SCI, and some people know Carnegie Mellon. So I work for the CERT Division at the Software Engineering Institute, which is attached to Carnegie Mellon. We are an FFRDC, which is a federally funded research and development center. We do lots of awesome stuff. We are hiring. This gentleman in the front right here is looking for a pen tester.
All right, everyone, quick reminder that we do have lightning talk tracks going over during lunch. So if you'd like to go to either the gold or black track, we do have some 30-minute talks lined up. Otherwise, feel free to continue your lunch. We do have beverages that are being served, including of the adult variety. So if you would like to join those talks, though, please start making your way there. We'll give you about 5 minutes.
Or we'll just continue along. So some terms, and these look pretty obvious, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when I say things. So a threat, when I say threat, I think of anything that negatively impacts your business, right? It can be an advanced persistent threat, such as a nation state. It could be a script kiddie who just found this super new tool and starts banging on your website. It can also be an insider, right? An insider threat or a disgruntled employee. It could also be the backhoe operator about to put their bucket through your internet line, right? That's also a threat to your business. A vulnerability, a known or unknown weakness. So the most popular would be 0 days, right? That's what we all hear about in the news, 0 day this, 0 day that. Vulnerabilities can also be propping your door open. So if you have access control at your organization and somebody's moving stuff and they put a door blocker in there, that's also a vulnerability. Assets. So there are 4 types of assets when I talk about them. So information, so any information created by your system. So if you have a customer relation management system, the data created by the CRM would be an information asset. Log files can also be information assets. Then we have technology, which are just the hardware and software that drive your business. People, we also consider people assets, the people that operate your critical service. And then facilities. The facilities would be the brick and mortar buildings where any of the other asset types reside. Risk. So if you've taken your CISSP, you're probably thinking threat times vulnerability. That's the base one, right? If you come from different lines of business, you may be thinking probability and severity or impact and likelihood. When I talk about risk, I talk about the likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability and the severity of that exploitation. That is how I typically define risk. We have qualitative and quantitative, which are both 2 different types of risks. For us, non-experts in risk, qualitative is usually where we start. That'll be where you see a matrix, where you'll have low, moderate, and high, and then maybe different items. So 2 popular qualitative risk analysis are Dread, which is made by Microsoft, and then Octave, which is a Carnegie Mellon product. Quantitative is for professionals. This is where you speak in terms of finances or percentages. A really good example is FAIR, Factor Analysis for Information Risk. They fancy themselves a quantitative risk analysis. Also, if you read the book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, they will talk about using confidence intervals and Monte Carlo simulations to be able to make a statement such as, I can state with 90% confidence that if you don't install this control, you will have a 20 to 25% of data breach in the next 6 months. That's very complicated and not the subject of today's talk, but that is where people want to go. They want to be able to quantify their risks. And then two of the topics we'll talk about today, Stride and Octave. Stride is a threat modeling framework created by Microsoft in the late 90s. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. We'll get into that and what it actually means. And then Octave is a risk analysis framework, operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and you'll see why in a moment. Okay, so what exactly is this, and what and why should we do this? So you want to do the threat modeling as early in your development lifecycle as possible. So if you think of discover, design, develop, debug, deploy, maintain, dispose as the system development or software development lifecycle, you want to move this as far left, because this is going to help you with your testing. And I think we've all seen that when you do testing or have your requirements defined, you are going to save your company money because you're going to find vulnerabilities or issues with your product much quicker. So if you don't find it until it's published to the field, you have to get your help desk involved, and then somebody has to triage it, and it goes to level 2, and then developers have to be assigned to it, and management has to get involved. So it gets very costly very quickly the further down the pipeline you find a bug. Functional versus security testing. So I'm going to just use a login page as an example. So functional testing on a login page would basically be putting the right username with the right password in, and it logs you into the system, right? So that would be a check. Also, you would check for a login with a bad password, and it would say invalid username or password. Those would be typical tests that you would run against a login page. Security testing or negative testing is where you hit it with special characters. So first thing I would try on a login page is maybe some SQL injection, right? So I'm going to throw some single quotes or some other characters that may cause the system to deviate from its normal process flow. Or I'm going to fuzz the field and try to put 10,000 characters in it. Anything I can do to deviate. So that's great for technical folks, but business folks are going to say, why the hell am I spending money on this, right? It's added cost. So what you're, to business speak, you're going to increase the return on investment because you're going to move the finding of the vulnerabilities or the bugs to the left of your process, which is going to decrease your total cost of ownership. Right? It's also going to save you a little bit of embarrassment, because if you don't find something until it gets in the news or it gets in the public, it will make its way to the news, and then you will have egg on your face. So increase ROI, decrease TCO. Okay, so one of the, I'm assuming everybody in here is familiar with OWASP, right? Right, great company. International, right? Security professionals all over the world participate. They have many top 10 lists, including the one we'll talk about today. In addition to mobile and proactive controls, Z Attack Proxy is a really good open source tool you can use to test your application. And then SAM, for those that would like to institutionalize the practices that help build better software. SAM. So as you'll see, there are two lists up here. I have the 2013 and the 2017. There was some movement, but not a great deal. They changed some titles. Injection is still at the top. I would have thought we would have fixed that since 2003, but apparently we have not. Cross-site scripting, sensitive data exposure. Two of the big ones that don't get a lot of love are security misconfigurations and using components with known vulnerabilities. Software supply chain is becoming one of the biggest problems we have, because as people just adopt code off GitHub and don't really run it through code analyzer, you're introducing vulnerabilities to your solution and you may not even realize. All right, so threat modeling with Stride. It's actually pretty easy. So we have our spoofing, tampering, repudiation, so on and so forth. They are each associated with a security principle that you should be familiar with. So the reason why they called it Stride is because they couldn't come up with a good acronym using CIA and the other terms. So that is why they came up with Stride, because it sounded cool. Anyways, what they've decided is you have the 6 threat categories, and you have 4 different depictions that are part of your data flow diagram. So you're going to talk about external entities, which would be web browsers or third-party integrations. So if you're using OpenID Connect or an OAuth and you're sending it off to have somebody else authenticate your users, that would be considered an external entity. And if you'll look in the top left corner, you'll see that you don't execute every element of Stride against every type of entity, right? So they've gone through and made it, this is where you should start. Now, if you feel that something else needs to be evaluated, feel free. This was just their starting point. Any questions so far? Nope. Yep, right. All right, so what you do is you draw a data flow diagram. In a large system, this can get pretty unwieldy. So if you're doing a brownfield, so an existing situation, maybe break it up into blocks. If this is greenfield, maybe do the same thing. As you can see, I have all 4 asset types, but then I also have dashed lines. The dashed lines, to me, just represent network enclaves. So we may have DMZs, you may have extra secure storage in the back because you have your databases. I just want to talk a little bit about the various data stores I have. So if you look over here, I have customer data, but I also have the database backup, right? A lot of people will back up the database with sensitive data and then forget they did it, and now you have access to your system. So it doesn't do a lot of good to have sensitive information backed up to a log and then not pay attention to the database backup. You'll also see that I have a process here for RDBMS, right? That's your relational database management system. So when you evaluate a database, you have to evaluate the data store and the process by which you're evaluating. Again, for reference, we have in the bottom left corner the Stride matrix. And then this is a term, a sentence that I created to help make sure that you classify it. Is there a threat of a threat actor using one of the Stride executing against one of your data flow diagrams by exploiting an OWASP top 10? So is there a threat of a threat actor spoofing an external entity by exploiting SQL injection, right? And then you can make a quick snap decision. Yes, that sounds like something I should pursue, or no, I'm not going to worry about it because it doesn't seem likely. Okay? So that can get really complicated to go through all 10 for all the time. So what I would encourage you to do, and this slide deck will be available for download after the conference, go through and just mark X's in a bigger matrix. So I pick spoofing external entity, injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, and you go down, and this is, again, just something to start with. So it may be different for your system, but these are the different OWASP top 10s that you would evaluate per combination. If you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, A6 and A9 are completely checked, right? Because you should be checking for known components, known vulnerable components, and misconfigurations at every step of the way. So imagine you do this against your system. You're going to have a large number of things that you're going to want to check, right? And if this is the first time you're doing a threat model, you're going to be overwhelmed because there's going to be 400 things for you to check on, right? And you're going to panic and throw it in the garbage and say, just stick your head in the sand. So what you can do is use a risk analysis such as Octave Allegro to help you order the important risks near the top. So it's a qualitative risk analysis framework, and it's going to help you prioritize the work, and it does it in 8 steps. The first step is defining your risk measurement criteria, and don't do this by yourself. Go find your business folks, right? You are in business. You're doing security to help the business move at the speed as fast as it can, okay? So don't try to make the risk measurement criteria by yourself. Go find some business folk or some risk folks. So I come from healthcare, so obviously my example is going to be healthcare based. So the most important thing in medical device manufacturing is do no harm to the patient. So that is the #1 priority we have when we did risk analysis. So near the top I have patient safety, and then I have low, moderate, and high. So low, no or negligible. Delay in treatment, a couple hours maybe for moderate, and then a much longer delayed or even death would be considered high, right? And then even if you don't hurt the patient, you can't run afoul of the regulators, right? You can't run afoul of Health and Human Services or any other entity that is paying attention. So that would be the second highest risk for the organization. Then we have brand damage, loss of productivity, and customer confidence, right? So you define your risk matrix. I pick 5 as a good starting place. You can do 4, you can do 20. Obviously, if you do 20, it's going to take you a much greater amount of time to do the risk analysis. So we've defined the risk measurement criteria. We kind of got these next to the information asset profile in the containers for free with our data flow diagram, because we've defined where the data resides, and we define what our network looks like, or what our components look like together. Our areas of concern and threat scenarios we already did using our STRIDE analysis. Is there a threat of a threat actor kind of activity? All right, so all we have left now is to identify and mitigate risks. So here's an example, right? We're going to talk about spoofing an external entity. So remember when I said patient safety is the highest? It gets weighted as a 5, right? So let's say I'm spoofing an external entity and I'm evaluating SQL injection, right? Well, typically when people do SQL injection, they're not going in to change data. They're just going in to exfiltrate the data from the network, right? So patient safety, not really. It's not going to delay diagnoses. It's just the data is going to go away, right? So it gets a low. But since it's already weighted as our highest, it gets a 5. So we get 5 points for patient safety. It may not negatively impact the safety of the patient, but you're going to hear from your regulator, right? If you disclose more than 500 records in a geographical area, you have to report it to Health and Human Services. So that would mean that would be a high. And since it was rated second highest priority, it gets 4. So 4 times 3 is 12. So regulatory legal gets a score of 12. And then we have brand damage, productivity, and confidence. They have their own scores. We get a risk score of 28. We move on to the next one, right? So you can do this in an Excel spreadsheet with drop-downs. It's pretty easy. But you're going to do it for all of the various threats that you went through. So every time you did, is there a threat of a threat actor doing this, that, or the other thing, each one of those would get a line in your Excel spreadsheet. Now, something you'll come to realize for those that participate in agile software development is this isn't going to fit neatly into a sprint, right? So you may have some risks that are off the charts high, but are going to take 6, 8, 10, 12 sprints. So you're going to take those epics and break them down into smaller components of work. But at least when you go to do that, your product owner is going to be able to look at this justification as to why it's important that it's scheduled in your release. So we've identified all these issues. We have a couple hundred to fix. Where do we go to look for help? So the Cloud Security Alliance, Cloud Control Matrix, has a lot of really good ways to secure your cloud installation. Internet Engineering Task Force Standards, OAuth 2, Transport Layer Security, password-based key derivation functions. All of that stuff is already done for you. There's no sense rolling your own. Many of the frameworks, such as the .NET framework, has PDKDF built right in, so you don't even have to write those. Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. They've just released version 7.1, another great resource for determining how to mitigate risks. 853 if you're FISMA, governed by government FISMA requirements, you can use 853, or 171, controlled unclassified information, largely in line with 853, and then obviously international standards, ISO 27000. You're going to say, wait, Matt, where's 27001? 27001 is like a 3-page document with just titles. The meat is all in 27002. 27018 is privacy in the cloud. If you come out of this with anything, do not make your own. You are not smarter than the entirety of the international security community. You just don't do it. There's a lot of good stuff. OWASP is also another really good place. I can't believe I took that bullet out, but OWASP would be a good place to go because they have their proactive controls. So when I gave this talk before, people would say, well, I don't have a web app. So where do I go to find my threats? Well, there's a really, really, really good document that is published. I will have the resources in the last slide. It's called DODCAR, which is the DoD Cybersecurity Architecture Review. And they've worked with the MITRE attack framework and basically given you the landscape of what they consider the most prolific threat sources available today for your advanced persistent threats. So it's broken down into stages, objectives, and actions. And as you can see, there are quite a number of threats or ways folks can exfiltrate data or do other damage. So in that document, you'll see they'll have a heat map and a coverage map. So the heat map is actually based on observed activities by the NSA. So the darker the color, the more prevalent they've seen it in the wild. So if you look up here for Engage, Phase 2, spear phishing emails. Those never work, right? So that obviously, they do work because they see them all the time. Also see websites, vulnerabilities in your websites, right? So these are the things that if maybe you're not developing software, but rather you're a systems engineer or an architect, you could use this as your source of threat for what things you need to mitigate. And then we have the coverage map. So that was observed. This is based on a bunch of SMEs in a room evaluating against protect, detect, respond from the cybersecurity framework. So they'll go through the exact same boxes as you saw on the other page, but they will, a bunch of smart people got in a room and threw numbers out, basically what happened, right? And now the higher the numbers, so obviously red is something you should consider, and green may be something you can push off till later. So, in summary, familiarize yourself with threat sources. You can either use the OWASP Top 10, you can use DODCAR, you can use a combination of both. Create your data flow diagram using the 4 shapes of STRIDE. Define your risk measurement criteria from Octave Allegro so that you can prioritize them properly. Complete your worksheets. Again, I just used Excel. Calculate your scores, sort rank, identify industry standard mitigations, do not roll your own, and then practice. It's going to take you a while to get good at this. I mean, it is difficult when you just first come in and look at a data flow diagram and try to make sense of all the threats. That is partially why I have that statement. Is there a threat of a threat actor? Because that will help you scope your work. And with that, I think that is it. So here are the resources. So obviously OWASP, DODCAR and NSA Threat Framework V2 are at the bottom. They're pretty good reads, especially for technical folks. You may consider things that you hadn't considered before when you're writing software or building out your cloud IaaS or what have you. And with that, any questions? No, I'll be walking around, so if you have any questions you want to do one-on-one, that's fine. Again, I encourage you at 4 o'clock to go to Justin Forbes' talk on how to frustrate a pen tester. He's pretty good at it, so I think you'll enjoy that as well. So thank you very much.